Hi, Belton. Thank you so much for being a part of Everyday Grace TV.
Thanks, Mary. Good to be here. And Jay, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Well, Belton, you've heard several different people tell their stories on Everyday Grace TV, and I'm wondering if you think that there's a connection between our personal stories and God's story.
Wow, yes, indeed. The biblical story, God's story, is so real because God sometimes seems so very present and sometimes so far away. I'm thinking about perhaps the most familiar passage in all of the Bible, the 23rd Psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. And that, that's part of the story, and that's good to hear. But the chapter just before that, Mary, the 22nd Psalm, the one that Jesus quoted on the cross, says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And my story is like that. Sometimes God seems very close, and sometimes God seems far, far away. Like when I pick up a newspaper or go on the internet to look at the news, and I see a story and I think, wow, God is present in that. Isn't that wonderful? And then I look at the next story and where is God in that? Well, long answer to say, yeah, I think our stories and the biblical stories do connect with one another.
Belton, when I was listening to Keegan's interview a little bit earlier, Keegan talked about the woman who came in and she said to him, thank you for seeing me. And I was thinking about words that Hagar used in her story about being seen. And I wonder if there's a way that maybe you could recall that story for us and for our viewers, what that story where that connection may be.
Yeah, be glad to. It's one of those stories, Jay, that I think you look at and you think, wow, that's in the Bible, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's that kind of story. It's back in the first book of the Bible, book of Genesis, about the 15th, 16th chapter, right along in there. And it starts with Abram and his wife. Abram is kind of the big brouhaha around the community. And he and his wife have no children, but they keep remembering that God had promised them, Abram, you're going to have a child who's going to have children, who's going to have children, who's going to have children, going to have children. You get the picture. So many that it'd be more than counting the stars. You just won't be able to keep up with it. The only problem was that Abram had not had child number one. Well, his wife Sarah had an idea. She said, look, Abram, I've got this slave girl named Hagar. Yeah, she's not bad for the eyes, if you know what I mean. So why don't you and Hagar have a baby? I'd have to say this is not exactly a traditional marriage. Well, Abram was old, but he wasn't an old fool, so he agreed. And he did, well, sometimes the Bible said he slept with Hagar, shacked up with her, hooked up with her. And guess what? 9 months later, there was going to be about 8 pounds and 6 ounces of proof of their unusual relationship. So now, here's Hagar, and she is walking around as the mother of Abram's child. And you can guess what happened around the community. She's beginning to show a bit, Right. So folks are looking to say, she's the mother of Abram's baby. Isn't she wonderful? And folks started oohing and awing over Hagar, and Sarah, who was Abram's wife, she sort of faded into the background.
Oh, goodness.
And Hagar herself even took on a certain contempt
of course.
For Sarah, Well, you might imagine Sarah didn't take too kindly to all that, so she really began making things really rough on Hagar. Really, you can imagine. She was still a servant after all, and the Bible said she dealt harshly with her, and your mind just runs about all the kinds of things she might have done. So finally, Hagar has had enough of that, and even though she is heavy with child, she runs away. So now, instead of being kind of the toast of the town, Hagar is out in the wilderness where there's no food, no water, no diaper service, and God must have seemed very far away. But God sent a messenger. Sometimes in the Bible they call them angels, means God's messenger, who said to her, Hagar, what's going on here? And you think about it, in all of the story, that's the first time anyone called her by her name. Before that, she was, Sarah's slave or servant or the maid girl or maybe just, hey, you. It wasn't, she had no name. But God's messenger calls her by name. To me, that's pretty powerful.
Names are important.
They are indeed. So she goes back to the village, but now she knows she does not go back alone. God is with her. God has seen her. It turns out that God knows Hagar and knows her story. And Hagar is so moved by that, she creates a new name for God. She calls God El Roi. It's a Hebrew word that means the God who sees me. That word can also mean mirror. I think it's a great image. God can see what's in my mirror. You know, I like that. Well, that's good news and it's bad news. It means if God can see, there's no place to hide from God. But, praise God, it also means that God who loves me knows my story, warts and all, and still loves me. So I guess in some way, Hagar's story is our story of a God who sees.
Well, Belton, let me ask you, then can God's grace be found in something as simple as our stories?
Yeah, that is, that's right to the heart of the matter. It's a good way to put it, because when I hear someone else's story, in a sense, I've become God's ears for that story. When I see someone else's story, I've become God's eyes for that story, God's presence through me. So it becomes a rather remarkable thing that I've become the presence of God because God has used me to hear and to see and appreciate and to be in touch with that story of someone else's. So that's God's grace. And yeah.
To see and to be seen, to hear and to be heard. We've been reminded of that in a powerful way, how important that is. Belton, I want to thank you for being with us today on Everyday Grace TV.
Sure, good to be here.
We're going to end today's episode with a new song called Tell Me the Story, performed by myself, Adam Seat, and Jimmy Creighton. Thank you so much for watching Everyday Grace TV.